was here and what he did to this organization.
But listen to me. I gave you a clear assignment in our own zone. I know for a fact you can shut guys down, and you are going to lay it all on the line out on that ice right now. Listen, if we are stepping onto that rink with this kind of weak effort, we are practically handing them the game on a silver platter. Give me a break here. Are we going to sit around the locker room whining all night? Or are we actually going to do something about it? In the brutal world of professional hockey, every guy lacing up his skates has had two types of bench bosses. There is the guy they would happily take a puck to the teeth for, and then there is the absolute nightmare they hope to never make eye contact with again. We are diving deep into the locker room files to uncover the masterminds who forged absolute ice legends, alongside the complete dictators who shattered spirits and ruined careers. Get ready for a hardcore look into the most worshipped, respected, and flat-out despised head coaches to ever stand behind a National Hockey League bench. And hey, if you are loving the content so far, do us a massive favor right now and smash that like button. It takes 2 seconds and it means the world to us. And if you are not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button and join the squad, because this is just getting started. Kicking things off, we have the undisputed king of locker room terror. They called him Iron Mike, a guy with a genius level hockey IQ paired with such a vicious, demanding personality that lacing up for him felt like serving a prison sentence. His entire playbook boiled down to one ruthless mindset. You secure the victory by any means necessary, even if it means burning every single bridge and friendship straight to the ground along the way. Looking back at his time in the league, it serves as a wild warning about a leader who absolutely knew how to drag a roster kicking and screaming to the ultimate championship peak. However, his day-to-day tactics were so intensely toxic that the second they hoisted the trophy, he would basically light a match and watch the entire organization go up in flames. Iron Mike did not just draw up plays on a whiteboard. His entire approach was deeply rooted in playing relentless, nasty mind games with his own roster. He governed his dressing rooms like a dictator, manufacturing constant drama and keeping guys absolutely terrified of making a single mistake on the ice. In his eyes, keeping his squad swimming in a state of pure anxiety and second-guessing themselves was the secret recipe for hoisting championship banners. He was notorious for stapling his absolute best, highest-paid franchise players to the pine for entire periods, without uttering a single word of explanation. The guy loved throwing his own men to the wolves during press conferences, and he gained legendary status for his absolutely unhinged goalie carousel. He would casually yank a starting netminder right in the middle of a crucial period. He did not even do it because the goalie let in a soft shot. He did it just to screw with the guy's head and shake up the energy in the building. There is an infamous story where he forced the Chicago Blackhawks roster to gear up for a full morning skate pack their bags board a team bus heading straight for the tarmac, jump on a charter flight all the way to Quebec and completely check into their hotel rooms. Only then did he drop the punchline their actual matchup was taking place back home in the Windy City. The entire agonizing trip was nothing more than a twisted psychological stress test, designed to see who would crack under the pressure. That era of absolute locker room dictatorship was defined by screaming matches and bitter rivalries with the very superstars carrying his squads. When he rolled into St. Louis, he immediately sparked an unforgettable, completely public blood feud with the face of the franchise, Brett Hull. We are talking about a guy who possessed one of the most lethal slapshots in the history of the sport, and sits among the top pure goal scorers to ever touch the puck. Instead of working with him, the head coach dragged Hull's work ethic through the mud in front of reporters, literally tore the alternate captain letter right off his sweater, and poisoned the well so badly that the sniper eventually went on record calling him a genuinely awful human being. Looking back on that complete disaster of a situation, there is zero chance of forgiveness for the absolute wreckage he caused during his tenure, not just to the players, but to the very soul of the hockey club. Yet, if you want the definitive craziest Iron Mike saga, you have to look at his stint running the show under the bright lights of Madison Square Garden with the New York Rangers. Back in 1994, the front office brought him in with one singular impossible mission: kill off a miserable 54-year championship drought. Astonishingly, he actually pulled it off. He relentlessly screamed at, manipulated, and quite literally bullied a locker room full of veterans all the way to a deeply emotional historic cup victory. Still, his daily grind was so incredibly toxic that a mere 30 days after the confetti fell at the Canyon of Heroes, he packed his bags and bolted. Things had gotten so remarkably bitter between him, the guys in the room, and the suits upstairs that he actually activated a weird contract technicality just to escape the very city he had just turned into champions. The complicated legacy of Mike. Keenan goes down in the history books as an absolute tactical genius who simultaneously left an apocalyptic wasteland of shattered relationships, furious executives, and emotionally scarred athletes in every single market he touched. He was the ultimate hockey villain, a man who believed pure panic and absolute chaos were the only ways to build a winner. However, the next bench boss on our list managed to construct one of the greatest dynasties in sports history by doing the exact opposite of everything we just talked about. He relied heavily on unspoken brilliance, a deeply thoughtful strategy, and an incredibly soothing locker room presence. Enter the legendary Al Arbor. While the previous guy operated like a military dictator, this man was the ultimate professor of the ice. The guys affectionately called him Radar, thanks to those massive thick-rimmed spectacles and his incredibly nerdy analytical obsession with hockey strategy. Out on Long Island, the man is treated like absolute royalty, a truly universally adored figure among the fan base. He was the silent, brilliant mastermind who took a ragtag, miserable expansion franchise and slowly molded them into an unstoppable juggernaut that essentially owned the 1980s. You would never catch him throwing a trash can across the room or blowing out his vocal cords at his players. Guys ran through brick walls for him purely out of massive respect. He radiated a quiet, unshakable confidence backed up by a defensive scheme that was light years ahead of the competition. Stepping behind the bench just a single season after the club was born into the league, he put on his hard hat and meticulously drafted and developed those young kids into an absolute wrecking crew. What followed was an absolutely jaw-dropping era of pure unfiltered winning that the modern era of the sport will honestly never witness again, with him calling the shots and steering the ship. Between the years of 1980 and 1983, the New York Islanders secured an unbelievable 4 back-to-back Stanley Cup championships, right in the middle of that historic stretch of absolute dominance. This powerhouse roster managed to conquer 19 straight postseason matchups. An absolutely mind-boggling milestone that has yet to be broken in any major North American professional league to this day. Yet, the deep affection fans hold for Al Arbor goes way beyond those championship banners hanging in the rafters. What truly cemented his legendary status was his incredibly unique and compassionate approach to handling his roster. He single-handedly cultivated a deeply bonded family-first environment behind closed doors, forging a fiercely dedicated brotherhood of athletes who would happily run through a brick wall for their head coach and for one another. While hockey lore is absolutely flooded with tales highlighting his steady, unassuming guidance, there is one particular anecdote that perfectly encapsulates his genius. During a truly iconic chapter of team history, right after suffering a completely gut-wrenching defeat in the grueling postseason, rather than screaming at his guys or flipping trash cans, Arbor simply strolled calmly down the center aisle of the team charter plane, silently passing out a cold beer to every single guy on the roster. It was an incredibly subtle yet profound gesture of unwavering confidence that instantly shattered the tension and allowed the locker room to breathe again. Unsurprisingly, the squad rallied back and ultimately claimed victory in that playoff round. His dedication to the Long Island organization was completely unbreakable. And that exact same level of devotion was beautifully reciprocated during what is widely considered one of the most tear-jerking milestones you will ever witness in the sport. Fast forward to the year 2007, well over a decade into his quiet retirement, when the 75-year-old hockey mastermind, who had famously stood behind the bench for exactly 1,499 regular season matchups for the club, he was formally invited to ink a 24-hour deal just so he could return and officially direct his 1,500th career game. Naturally, he stepped right back into the spotlight and his boys pulled off the victory. It served as the ultimate fairy tale send-off to the visionary architect who had painstakingly constructed that entire powerhouse organization entirely from scratch. To this day, Al Arbor remains a universally cherished hockey deity, an undisputed pioneer who vividly demonstrated that true sporting empires are forged through profound patience, brilliant strategy, and mutual human decency. Arbor essentially manufactured a legendary dynasty entirely on a foundation of unshakable trust. However, the next individual on our list carved out his entire legacy through absolute terror and intimidation, which ultimately led to one of the most spectacular fiery downfalls the hockey world has ever seen. Welcome to the dark and twisted saga of Mike Babcock. For well over 10 years, this guy was universally hailed as the absolute smartest guy in the building, regardless of what arena he walked into. The entire league viewed him as a tactical genius, an incredibly exacting and micromanaging bench boss who carried the ultimate pedigree of being a guaranteed stone cold champion. His jaw-dropping resume boasted a championship ring with the Detroit Red Wings back in 2008 alongside a pair of highly coveted Olympic gold medals while leading the Canadian national squad. So naturally, when the Toronto Maple Leafs handed him an utterly massive bank-breaking contract in 2015, everyone truly believed he was the ultimate missing ingredient required to end their decades-long championship drought. Instead, following his highly publicized and unceremonious termination from the Toronto bench in the fall of 2019, his previously flawless Golden Boy reputation was suddenly blown to absolute smithereens in the public eye. A relentless flood of deeply unsettling and horrific behind-the-scenes accounts suddenly started leaking out from the men who used to play for him, pulling back the curtain to expose that his history of hoisting trophies was completely overshadowed by a deeply ingrained habit of severe mental torture and relentless bullying, transforming his legacy into a stark warning for future generations of management. Without a doubt, the absolute most notorious and widely condemned incident occurred during his tenure up in Toronto, specifically targeting Mitch Marner while the kid was just navigating his very first rookie campaign. According to multiple corroborated reports, the veteran coach effectively trapped the incredibly young prospect in his office, demanding that he draft up a completely confidential piece of paper that explicitly graded every single guy on the roster, sorting them strictly from the most dedicated grinders all the way down to the guys he thought were coasting. In a move of sheer villainy, Babcock then immediately grabbed that supposedly secret piece of paper and deliberately exposed it directly to the veteran guys that the terrified rookie had placed at the very bottom of the barrel. It was an unbelievably calculated backstab engineered specifically to completely mortify a newly drafted kid while simultaneously attempting to poison the entire dressing room vibe against him from day one. Unbelievably, that grotesque manipulation tactic was merely the tip of a very dark iceberg. Ex-Detroit powerhouse forward Johan Franzen went completely on the record labeling his old boss as a malicious tyrant who actively hunted down vulnerable targets, dropping the absolute bombshell statement that he was hands down the most terrible human being he had ever crossed paths with. Franzen bravely opened up about enduring an agonizing multi-year stretch of horrific psychological and verbal assaults, highlighting one particularly vicious screaming meltdown on the bench right in the middle of the 2012 postseason run that literally triggered a severe debilitating mental breakdown for the star forward. Ultimately, this coach's professional life was permanently torched to the ground thanks to one last unbelievably creepy and absurd controversy. Fast forward to the summer of 2023. That's when the Columbus Blue Jackets wildly decided to hand him the reins in what was clearly intended to be his grand redemption tour. However, before the man even had the opportunity to step behind the bench for a single official puck drop, absolutely explosive headlines dropped alleging that he was forcefully ordering his new roster of guys to hand over their cell phones so he could scroll through their private camera rolls. It was a staggering, utterly unacceptable breach of basic human boundaries that he laughably tried to write off as a quirky team-building exercise. The resulting media firestorm and fan outrage were so overwhelmingly radioactive that the front office gave him no choice but to immediately step down, effectively slamming the door shut on his coaching livelihood under a permanent cloud of absolute shame and embarrassment. This guy's spectacular plunge from the absolute peak of the sport served as a massive reality check, loudly broadcasting that in today's modern era of professional hockey, having a track record of piling up wins simply was not enough to shield a bench boss who controlled his locker room through sheer terror and psychological warfare. Mike Babcock cemented his legacy as the ultimate modern-day dictator, a guy whose own squad genuinely despised lacing up their skates for him. However, the next hockey mastermind we are looking at was a glorious throwback, a gritty old-school enforcer of discipline whom every single skater absolutely revered and would run through a brick wall for. Enter Pat Burns. When you look up the exact definition of hard-nosed but completely fair in the hockey dictionary, you will find a picture of Pat Burns staring right back at you. Before stepping onto the ice, he actually wore a badge as a beat cop, and he dragged that exact same gritty lunch pail, blue-collared, a clock-punching mentality straight into every single franchise he ever took over. Standing behind the boards, he was an incredibly demanding, fiercely intense, and downright terrifying figure who took absolutely zero excuses, yet completely separating himself from the toxic bullies of the sport. This guy remained aggressively loyal and unflinchingly straight up with the guys in his locker room, always telling them exactly what they needed to hear. That genuine authenticity bought him an unprecedented level of league-wide admiration, something you almost never see in the utterly ruthless backstabbing business of professional hockey management. If you want to perfectly sum up his absolutely one-of-a-kind footprint on the game, you just have to look at one mind-blowing piece of hardware on his resume. He stands utterly alone as the only bench boss in the entire history of the National Hockey League to take home the Jack Adams Award for Coach of the Year, while steering 3 entirely distinct franchises. To make that monumental milestone even more completely insane, he managed to pull it off while commanding a trio of absolutely bloodthirsty, bitter divisional enemies. First, he conquered the hockey world with the Montreal Canadiens back in 1989. Then he completely turned around the Toronto Maple Leafs in 1993 and finally worked his magic for the Boston Bruins in 1998. The sheer reality that he was able to completely win the hearts of die-hard supporters and deeply skeptical locker rooms across 3 passionately despised rival cities speaks volumes about the monumental gravity and respect he carried wherever he went. You never had to guess what he was thinking. Every single skater knew precisely what their role was and where they ranked on his roster. He would not hesitate for a single second to scream right into the face of a franchise superstar who was slacking on a shift, but the minute the press conference started, he was the absolute first guy to throw himself in front of the media firing squad to protect his boys. That raw, unfiltered honesty was his trademark, and the guys wearing his sweater absolutely worshipped the ground he walked on because of it. However, even with all those massive regular season accolades piling up the ultimate holy grail of hockey, Lord Stanley's legendary mug kept slipping through his fingers year after agonizing year. That completely changed when the calendar flipped to 2003 and his golden opportunity finally knocked on the door. While he was barking orders from the bench for the heavily armored New Jersey Devils, this legendary tactician, who was privately waging an incredibly vicious life-or-death battle against cancer behind closed doors, miraculously dragged his squad through an absolute gauntlet, capturing a spectacularly dramatic Game 7 triumph in the Stanley Cup Final. The unforgettable broadcast footage of this famously hardened, suddenly tear-eyed warrior hoisting that massive silver chalice high into the arena lights remains one of the single most emotionally devastating and universally cherished snapshots in all of athletic history. It served as the absolute ultimate crown jewel to wrap up a remarkably long, fiercely fought, and deeply honored journey on the ice. Today, Pat Burns rests in the hockey pantheon as an absolute cultural icon. A magnificent leader who definitively proved to the entire world that you can push your guys to the brink with an iron fist, yet still keep their undying devotion intact. That was his magic. He was as tough as a $2 steak, yet the locker room consistently adored him. Alright, we have to stop right here for a second, because this is the real debate. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Who would you rather play for, a guy like Pat Burns, who is brutally tough but always has your back? Or a guy like Mike Keenan, who will drive you absolutely insane but might just win you a championship? Let us know, we read every single comment. Then, on the flip side of that same coin, we have another vintage operator, a guy whose suffocating brand of tough love ultimately sparked a massive exodus and alienated everyone under his command. Enter Daryl Sutter. If you cut this guy open, he bleeds frozen pond water. He is the absolute embodiment of pure unadulterated hockey DNA. He is an incredibly abrasive, completely humorless cattle rancher straight out of the brutal winters of Alberta. Around the league, he is notorious for his painfully awkward, utterly unintelligible muttering, explosively hostile media scrums, and an absolutely grueling, archaic leadership methodology that feels completely ripped out of the stone age of professional sports. Make no mistake, the man has 2 Stanley Cup rings on his fingers. His suffocating, physically devastating brand of trap hockey can absolutely grind opponents into dust when executed properly. However, his legacy is massively polarizing precisely because his dinosaur tactics continually acted like pouring gasoline onto a fire when introduced to the new generation of highly paid modern-era skaters. This generational warfare recently boiled over into a disastrous full-blown player uprising that completely tore the dressing room apart. The peak of his managerial mountain undeniably happened out on the West Coast while steering the ship for the Los Angeles Kings. His brutally heavy, defense-obsessed playbook turned out to be the absolute perfect missing puzzle piece for a remarkably seasoned, fiercely battle-hardened core group anchored by absolute warriors like Anze Kopitar and Dustin Brown. By relentlessly turning the screws, his punishing philosophy managed to wring out every single microscopic ounce of willpower from that talented lineup, propelling them to the absolute pinnacle of the sport with two magnificent championship parades down Hollywood Boulevard in 2012 and 2014. Those banners proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that his suffocating grind worked, but as the sport evolved into a lightning-fast showcase of skill, the stubborn rancher absolutely refused to adapt his prehistoric playbook. If you want to see a textbook collapse, just examine his latest explosive stint with the Calgary Flames, which perfectly illustrates his incredibly messy, bridge-burning descent into irrelevance. Parachuted in to save the day midway through the 2021 campaign, he initially jolted the franchise like a massive shot of adrenaline to the heart, completely turning the ship around and ultimately capturing that highly coveted Jack Adams trophy for the league's top tactician, taking home the Jack Adams honors as the premier bench boss of 2022 after steering the Calgary Flames into an absolutely crushing powerhouse campaign. Fast forward just 12 months, however, and that entire honeymoon phase crashed and burned in spectacular fashion. Word leaked out of the locker room that the guys in sweaters grew to absolutely loathe his non-stop pessimism, his brutally arrogant attitude, and his absolute refusal to talk to his guys like human beings. Nobody took a harder hit from that garbage culture than elite forward Jonathan Huberdeau. The franchise had just traded a king's ransom to pull him out of Florida right after he posted a jaw-dropping 115-point run. Instead of letting the superstar cook, the coach forced him into a suffocating trap-heavy defensive scheme that completely choked the life out of his playmaking magic. We watched in real time as his offensive numbers tanked by a mind-numbing 60 points, leaving him skating around the ice looking like a completely shattered ghost of his former self. Things behind closed doors devolved into such a complete radioactive wasteland that by the time the final buzzer of the regular season sounded, several franchise cornerstones basically gave management an ultimatum: either the coach gets his walking papers, or we are requesting a one-way ticket out of town. Backed into an impossible corner, the front office had absolutely no choice but to pull the trigger, handing him a pink slip and issuing a very public statement admitting that the clubhouse environment desperately needed a massive overhaul. Ultimately, this guy stands out as a glaring, massive warning sign about a once great mastermind who was far too stubborn to drop his dinosaur-era tactics. Refusing to connect with modern athletes turned him into public enemy number one among his own roster. That is the dark side of being stuck in the past when the gritty, iron-fisted routine finally hits a brick wall. However, stepping into the exact opposite end of the spectrum, we have a legendary old-school hockey mind who literally never took his foot off the gas pedal. The undisputed king of the bench, the absolute gold standard, the one and only Scotty Bowman. When you look at the pantheon of guys who hold a clipboard in this league, there is one tier strictly reserved for him. And then, way down below, you have the rest of the pack fighting for second place. This guy was an introverted mastermind, a tactical wizard who revolutionized the ice, and the single most heavily decorated bench boss to ever lace up a pair of dress shoes. You were not getting hugs or pep talks from him. He was the furthest thing from a player's best buddy, but the hockey world absolutely worships the ground he walks on for one undeniable fact: the man was an absolute machine when it came to securing championships. Armed with a razor-sharp tactical intellect that forged a jaw-dropping resume of victories that nobody will ever come close to touching. Just look at the ridiculous statistics. He hoisted Lord Stanley's legendary silver chalice an absurd 9 separate times while calling the shots, setting a league record that remains completely untouchable. Add to that his mind-blowing 1,244 regular season victories, and you are looking at a milestone so massive it might as well be carved in stone forever. But the most insane part of his entire Hall of Fame career is the reality that he carried 3 distinct organizations to glory across 3 completely separate eras of the sport, shutting down any doubters by proving his hockey IQ could evolve with the times. He was the mastermind behind the utterly terrifying Montreal Canadiens powerhouse that dominated the 1970s. The star-studded offensive juggernaut that was the 1990s Pittsburgh Penguins, and the relentless Detroit Red Wings machine that owned the late 1990s and early 2000s. Operating the bench like a ruthless grandmaster moving pawns, he was notoriously icy, emotionally walled off from his locker room, and completely void of sentimentality, treating millionaire athletes like mere gears in his machine. Yet, he processed the flow of the ice in ways mortal coaches could not even comprehend. Nobody on the planet was better at exploiting defensive matchups, completely dissecting rival strategies on the fly, and flipping the script with game-altering audibles right in the middle of a brutal shift. Beyond just strategy, he pushed the boundaries of the sport. Up north, he fine-tuned a relentless system that turned a stacked roster into an unstoppable force. Then over in the Motor City, he quite literally engineered the iconic Russian 5. An incredibly gutsy move where he tossed an entire line of Soviet-born skaters over the boards to play together as a single terrifying 5-man unit. It was a wildly unconventional gamble that introduced an aggressively fast-paced, dizzying style of puck control magic that left North American opponents completely bewildered and chasing shadows all over the rink. Even with all those tricks up his sleeve, his absolute superpower was reshaping his entire philosophy to fit the exact group of guys sitting in his locker room. The absolute peak of his motivational mastery went down under the bright lights of Motown, one where he sat down with franchise cornerstone and legendary sniper Steve Yzerman throwing down the ultimate gauntlet. He challenged the elite goal scorer to completely rewrite his DNA on the ice, convincing him to throw away the flashy point totals in order to transform into an elite, grinding two-way defensive nightmare. That massive ego check and willingness to sacrifice individual glory literally paved the runway for a dynasty that would terrorize the league for years to come. At the end of the day, his name is spoken with absolute undisputed reverence in hockey circles. An unassuming savant whose unmatched hockey intelligence completely rewired the DNA of the sport, cementing a legacy that will never ever fade. While Scotty Bowman pulled the strings from the shadows like a silent mastermind, the next bench boss on our list absolutely craves the blinding heat of the center stage. We are talking about a walking powder keg, a guy legendary for blowing a gasket and declaring all-out warfare on the sporting press. Brace yourselves, because we are diving headfirst into the chaotic universe of John Tortorella. Better known around the rink simply as Torts, this guy easily ranks as one of the most hotly debated, fiercely scrutinized figures to ever stand behind a National Hockey League bench. Do not get it twisted, the man has serious hardware, boasting a Stanley Cup ring and taking home the Jack Adams Award twice as the absolute top coach in the business. Even with that shiny trophy case though, his true legacy is a radioactive temper and a completely unapologetic in-your-face attitude that takes zero prisoners. Decades in the big leagues have turned his timeline into a non-stop reality show filled with headline-grabbing brawls against local beat writers. He is totally notorious for dragging his own franchise cornerstones through the mud in front of the entire world. His absolute refusal to compromise demanding guys either fall in line or pack their bags has basically torched professional relationships in every single city he has called home. If you want prime entertainment, just tune into his post-game media scrums, which are absolute blockbuster television for the wildest, most unhinged reasons imaginable. Year after year, he has absolutely unloaded on reporters dropping curse words like confetti during epic meltdowns. It is a completely regular occurrence to see him chuck his microphone storm off the podium and get into screaming matches with journalists who are just trying to ask a simple question. Within the hockey community, he holds the undisputed heavyweight title for being the absolute hardest guy with a whistle to deal with in front of a camera, and the craziest part is that he seems to absolutely thrive on playing the villain. Looking at how he runs a locker room, it is a massive paradox because he is always shouting from the rooftops about pushing the pace. He literally coined the phrase, safe as death, begging his rosters to take massive risks and light the lamp with some serious swagger. In reality, however, his squads are notorious for playing a brutal meat grinder defensive game where every single guy on the ice is expected to eat 90-mile-per-hour slap shots with their bodies. Throwing yourself in front of frozen rubber certainly puts tallies in the win column, and nobody can deny the gritty results. But that exact same punishing mentality has also ignited massive friction inside the room, pushing elite playmakers and snipers to their breaking point because they feel like their creativity is totally suffocated by having to play goalkeeper in the defensive zone. Make no mistake, Torts will never hesitate to figuratively drop the gloves with the absolute biggest names on his roster. During his Broadway days with the Rangers, he got into a highly publicized nasty beef with his absolute best goal scorer, Marian Gaborik. However, the ultimate train wreck of his career went down during his lone, totally doomed campaign leading the Vancouver Canucks back in 2014. The boys on the ice could not buy a win, and the entire locker room grew completely exhausted by his non-stop barking and biting. Everything boiled over into absolute madness during an intermission that felt like something ripped straight out of a pro wrestling script. Following a massive line brawl, he literally marched down the tunnel and tried to break into the Calgary Flames dressing room just to throw hands with their head coach Bob Hartley. The league slapped him with a massive 15-game suspension for the stunt, permanently cementing his legacy as a guy who operates purely on rage. Fast forward to his era leading the Columbus Blue Jackets, which serves as the ultimate masterclass in how this guy operates behind closed doors. He absolutely dragged that franchise to new heights, but the emotional toll behind the scenes was exceptionally brutal. He went to war in the press with the two most lethal weapons on his roster locking horns with young phenoms Pierre-Luc Dubois and Patrick Lane. He benched both of them, blasted their work ethic to any reporter who would listen, and created an environment so incredibly toxic that both franchise players demanded tickets out of town just to escape his locker room. His particular brand of chaos is not just confined to the professional leagues, either he managed to spark massive fires while representing his country. Selected to run the bench for the red, white, and blue at the 2016 World Cup of Hockey, he brought the drama immediately. He made huge waves by drawing a hard line, warning his all-stars that anyone taking a knee during the Star-Spangled Banner in a nod to the Colin Kaepernick protests would sit out the entire game. That American roster was absolutely loaded from top to bottom with elite talent and surefire Hall of Famers. Yet they hit the ice and completely laid an egg, getting swept under the rug without registering a single solitary victory in an embarrassing tournament exit. At the end of the day, Torts has the rings to back up his talk, but his journey to the top is easily the wildest, most bump-filled ride the sport has ever witnessed. We are looking at a lifelong resume built entirely on crossing the line and keeping the drama dialed up to an 11. That is John Tortorella in a nutshell, a guy who keeps his players in check through pure intimidation and endless friction. Now, let us totally flip the script. Our final mastermind is a universally adored icon who showed the hockey world you can hoist the cup using the exact opposite energy. He led with unadulterated, spreadable happiness, living by the legendary motto that it is always a fantastic day to hit the ice. Enter Badger Bob Johnson. Looking back across the long, blood-stained history of this great game, you would be hard-pressed to find a single soul who commands as much respect and genuine affection as Badger Bob, a brilliant mastermind who completely changed how the sport was played. He was not just a guy with a whistle, he was an absolute genius of a professor who elevated everyone lucky enough to share the ice with him. We are talking about a guy whose absolute obsession with the sport carried an energy so electric it literally rewired the DNA of American hockey from the ground up. Watching him climb the mountain to become an ultimate professional champion remains one of the most tear-jerking triumphant narratives this brutal game has ever delivered to its fans. If you want to understand what made him tick, you just have to look at his legendary trademark mantra. It is a great day for hockey. That was not just some corporate slogan, the man lived and breathed those words every single morning he woke up. He did not treat being at the rink like punching a time clock. Instead, he attacked every practice with the giddy brilliance of a mad scientist in a laboratory. You are looking at a bona fide pioneer, a relentless scholar of the ice who became one of the first North American minds to actually respect and dissect the global game. While others relied entirely on old-school grit, he was busy tearing down borders, intensely studying the slick tactics and grueling conditioning regimens of the mighty Soviet and European powerhouses. Long before he even stepped foot behind a professional bench, his name already commanded massive respect across the entire hockey landscape. He practically turned the University of Wisconsin into a collegiate juggernaut, cementing his legacy by capturing 3 massive national championships. Beyond the college rinks, he served as the master architect behind the modern explosion of United States hockey on the world stage. He took the reins for multiple Olympic squads and national rosters, guiding the Stars and Stripes through some incredibly fierce international battles. After putting the red, white, and blue on the map and running the show in Calgary for a bit, the Pittsburgh Penguins brought him to the Steel City in 1990. Now, that Pittsburgh locker room was an absolute powder keg, bursting with arguably the most lethal offensive firepower the league had ever witnessed. You had generational icons like Mario Lemieux and a young, dynamic Jaromir Jagr leading the charge on the ice. The catch: they were a completely reckless, disorganized squad that could score at will, but had zero idea how to actually capture a championship. Enter Badger Bob. His relentlessly upbeat attitude and professor-like patience served as the exact remedy that dysfunctional locker room craved. He completely overhauled their culture, injecting a rock-solid foundation of discipline that the boys initially fought but ultimately embraced. He managed to convince a wildly talented bunch of renegades to buy into his groundbreaking, hyper-innovative systems. Decades before it became the industry standard, he was the visionary, staying up all night using endless hours of film sessions to expose opponents' weaknesses to his squad. That monumental effort paid off instantly. In his debut campaign, he guided those Penguins all the way to hoist the 1991 Stanley Cup. It was the absolute first taste of ultimate glory for the franchise, the gorgeous pinnacle of his entire career. But that massive victory parade was shadowed by a creeping tragedy. Just a handful of months after he joyously raised that 35-pound silver chalice above his head, doctors hit him with a devastating terminal brain cancer diagnosis. The brutal illness moved relentlessly, and the legendary bench boss tragically passed away in November of 1991. It felt like a massive gut punch to the entire sports world, leaving fans and players completely shattered by the sudden loss. The boys in Pittsburgh refused to let his fire die, vowing to dedicate every single shift of their upcoming campaign to his unforgettable spirit. With the brilliant Scotty Bowman stepping in to steer the ship, an emotionally charged Penguins roster rallied together to capture back-to-back titles in 1992. What happened next was totally unheard of. The league brass actually bent their own strict rules, granting a rare spectacular exception to permanently etch his name into the silver of the cup a second time. Even though he tragically could not be there to draw up the plays that season, his spirit was essentially guiding them through every single grueling playoff round. That beautiful exception stands today as the ultimate proof of the deep, unbreakable bond he forged with his players and how heavily he influenced the modern era. To this day, Badger Bob remains a heavily revered titan of the sport, immortalized in the rafters and in the hearts of the die-hard fans. He was a visionary who proved that pure joy paired with relentless tactical evolution leaves an impact that outlasts any single game or season. His story is the ultimate proof that the most brutal legacy-defining wars in this sport are not just waged with flying fists or sharp skates. Sometimes, the true battles go down on a dry erase board, navigating ruthless media scrums and breaking through the massive egos deep inside the players' heads. At the end of the day, the pulse of a championship franchise always beats strongest from the brilliant mastermind standing behind the bench. So, I am throwing the puck over to you guys. Who takes the crown as the greatest mastermind to ever call the shots, and who is the absolute worst? Jump into the comments and let the ultimate debate kick off. And before you bounce, if you made it all the way to the end of this one, you already know what to do. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring that notification bell so you never miss a single breakdown. We drop fire hockey content constantly, and trust me, you do not want to sleep on what is coming next. We will see you in the next one.